Still have people coming in, but I think we're going to start because we have quite a packed meeting. So we will continue letting people in, but in the meantime, we will start. First of all, to introduce myself, I'm Florence Martin, the Executive Director of Better Care Network. And it's my fantastic pleasure to welcome you today to this meeting on behalf of both Better Care Network and colleagues at Disability Rights International. Our meeting today, first of all, we will have interpretation in Ukrainian. And I wanted to, if we can have the slide on interpretation, I want to make sure that colleagues who are not English speakers are able to see how they can join the channel. So if you're familiar with Zoom, I think we all are nowadays, with COVID, we have interpretation, simultaneous interpretation. You will see that at the bottom of your Zoom screen, there's a little button that enables you to choose the channel. You need to choose the channel in the language that you would like to hear. So if you would like to hear in Ukrainian, please choose Ukrainian. Otherwise, if you would like to hear in English, please choose the English channel. The other thing as well is we have also live captioning enabled. And if you would like to enable live captioning, there's a little button similarly on the bottom of your Zoom screen, which is live transcript. Just click on that and you will be able to get live captioning as well. Thank you. So we will start this meeting. We still have many colleagues. We have a really packed agenda and we're really excited. We have an amazing group of actors with us today. The focus of this meeting, as you have seen from the invitation, is really the situation of children with disabilities in particular in residential care in Ukraine, but also those children who were in residential care and who left residential care either to return to their families or to be evacuated or relocated, both within Ukraine and outside. Our aim is to really focus and drill down on concrete recommendation. We are going to have a number of actors that are going to speak to the situation. But what we would like to do with this group is to have some really good discussion and to come up with programmatic recommendation about what needs to happen to address the situation of these children right now, but also what are the implications for the system longer term. And as a result, we're going to be exploring with you and focusing very much on what's happening and what's not happening and what should be happening. And this meeting, of course, is only going to be the start of this conversation, and we will follow up with this, but it's important for us to focus. We're really hoping to focus on solution. As a result, if you can go to the next slide. Our agenda is shaped around discussion around different aspects of their situation and how do we identify what's happening and what needs to happen. We will start with a overview of key challenges, which will be given by our colleagues from Disability Rights International based on the assessments they've done recently of the situation of children with disabilities in residential care in Ukraine. We will then follow up with 4 separate sessions where we'll have a short presentation by an expert that will talk to us about different aspects. Session 1 will be looking particularly at the mapping, registration, the data issue. Where are those children? Who are they? What information is being gathered? Session 2 is going to be looking specifically at the life-saving measures needed to protect these children in the institution currently. Session 3 is going to be looking at community services that are needed to support reintegration and family-based care, what's required, what's happening and what's not. And session 4 is going to look at the implication for the system reform, and particularly how do we integrate the system reform into this emergency response to ensure that we actually have long-lasting solution for these children. So we have quite a packed session. As a result, we will provide you with an opportunity after the short presentation by the actor to raise your hand to give comments or recommendation. We will also have a Jamboard where you will be able to add your thoughts, your comments about each of the session. Thank you, Selina, for sharing this. The link is going to be in the chat if it's not there already. And you'll see that on your left side, there is a little sticky note, and you can add a sticky note. Now, we will encourage you to use the Jamboard to be adding in particular your recommendation, your comments, your thoughts. We will not be able to address all of your suggestions. We will not be able to hear from everybody because we have a very large meeting. But we want to make sure that we capture your thoughts and ideas and recommendations. So if you're not able to speak, or even if you're able to speak, we encourage you to go to the Jamboard and add your recommendation. If you have questions for the panelists, we ask that you put them in the chat. But we would encourage you to focus. We will make sure that if you have questions or you want clarification, that we'll go back to the panelists. If not at this meeting, we will follow up afterwards. But we'd like to encourage the discussion to be focused at this stage on comments, thoughts, recommendation, and we can also deal with clarification afterwards. So we hope that through this process, we'll be able to have a really rich discussion and at the very least have the beginning of very concrete discussion around what is missing and what needs to happen to address the urgent situation of these children in Ukraine. So it is, without further ado, because our time is very limited, it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. Eric Rosenthal is the Executive Director of Disability Rights International, many of you will know, and Helmia Korillo is the Ukraine Rapid Response Specialist with Disability Rights International, and they will provide that overview about the situation of these children. Over to you, Eric and Helmia.
Thank you, Florence, and hello, everybody, welcome. I am going to be speaking to you from a Ukrainian village bomb shelter right now, just in case. So excuse my background. And I'm just gonna go to set the tone for the discussion that we're going to have today. So Ukraine has a history of institutionalization of children, and up to 2015, children without disabilities and with disabilities, with perceived disabilities, with behavioral issues of Roma origin, and even from low-income families were placed into institutions to receive a state-funded care. Since 2015, it has started to change due to the launch of the institutionalization reform. However, nothing has changed for children with disabilities. They remained even more marginalized than before, more invisible also, at least before the February 24. The medical model of disability, segregated facilities, and the belief that this is the only way, the right way to care, quote unquote, care for people with disabilities, it was intellectual disabilities and developmental disabilities, resulted in the system of the Ministry of Social Policy institutions housing thousands of children and young adults. And I use the word housing here because what they do there with the children is difficult to call care. And it only becomes obvious if you go inside and spend some time in the institutions, which I did, both pre-war in 2012 to 2015 and after the start of the full-scale Russian invasion. We did not see anything new. Segregated services for children and adults with disabilities is unfortunately a widespread practice in Ukraine and legacy of Soviet times. The war did not create the problem. The war only exacerbated it and shed a light on it. Could you please go to the next slide? It already exacerbated what was happening behind the closed doors. During the poorly coordinated evacuation effort, we witnessed a kind of a triage system. Less disabled children were taken across the border, while more disabled left in the institutions on the west of Ukraine in relative safety. Further, some of the institutions have not been evacuated and are now either under occupation, like Kherson and Kharkiv, where used to be in the occupation, like Chernihiv, under the shelling right now, like Sumy institutions, or very close to potential Russian target, like a grain warehouse in Ladizhin. Why they were not evacuated so far? It's a rhetorical question. It was too difficult, not enough transportation, not enough staff willing to accompany, and multiple other reasons that just show how ineffective, slow, and cumbersome this system of care, again, quote unquote, is. Before the war, there was a very poor and ineffective system of oversight also, far from disability inclusive data. Let's just say institutions were counted, but children were not, or people there were not. The need of institutions usually were confused with the needs of children. For example, during the COVID pandemic, when the schools were closed, including boarding schools for children with disabilities, more than 30,000 children were returned home with no proper assessment, with no increased support to the families in the time of war, and we do not know where each child is, was, and will be. And the risk of trafficking that has been already there has increased tremendously. But what is most important is that no one is assessing the needs of these children. Hence, the emergency response is not exactly inclusive because, first of all, it's impossible to be inclusive in the segregated care facility. And second, it's impossible to plan services without knowing clearly what the exact individual needs are and where these children are. And moreover, any international help that goes into these facilities has low efficiency now and is harmful in long term because it does perpetuate the inherently abusive system. And next slide, please. I'll give you a quick comparative example of 3 institutions of the same type, legally the same type. All of them have the same name and under the Ministry of Social Policy, who were all hosting children from Donetsk region institution. We all can imagine how the system is stretched now. So some of these institutions who received children from the same place, from Drushkivka, in almost equal numbers. Some of them had 0 international support. Some of them had a lot of involvement, like extra staff, professional support, material base, and even washing machines, professional washing machines. The result is unfortunately the same. The depressed, malnourished kids tied to beds and benches to prevent their self-harming behavior, of course. But this is not even metaphor. This is what we've seen. This is what I've seen with my own eyes and then in my nightmares afterwards. Then another example, an institution from Kyiv region evacuated abroad, and the father of a 16-year-old boy did not know where they were evacuated. There was no information for 3 months. His half-sister, who was also displaced to Switzerland with her 3 children, had finally found the boy's whereabouts somewhere in Germany, they told her, and she was not allowed to come visit, talk on the phone, or even not to even mention to take him back into her family. So we're talking about severed family links. Then another example, a doctor in a specialized facility, the one that is viewed as necessary for children with complex intellectual disabilities and epilepsy, confessed that his hands are tied. In order to do certain medical tests and procedures to administer necessary medicine, he has to call an ambulance. So we're talking about the facility with more than 100 people, most of them in beds with seizure disorders. And this is not a healthcare facility, so they don't have a license to do the care they are defined to do. A 10-year-old boy whose family was on the east, evacuated from Donetsk region, placed into without intellectual disabilities, placed into institution for children with disabilities, and his only rescue is the phone. Is his only way of stimulation and retaining his mental capacities because he has no one to play with, and his everyday looks the same, exactly the same, doing nothing in between timely meals and hygiene. And of course, in the middle of among the children, over-medicated children who are just rocking back and forth. Then again, I'm in the Mukachevo region. There is an institution here where young women in the institution for children, and they are still referred to as kids by the director because they are in the children's institution, are working in the field daily. Even now, when we are experiencing a tremendous heat wave, when it's impossible to even be outside. And finally, a new institution had just been opened and renovated in Zakarpattia region, is about to host 120 children who have lost their homes in Bucha, Mariupol, and similar places. And in the news, the presenter says, everybody is willing to help now in times of war. And my question is immediately, why no one is doing everything possible to reunite them with the families, support the families, kinship care, and 1,000 of alternative options? We all agree that institutional care is harmful for all children. And supporting already existing institution is convenient because the practice is already there. But we're here, like all of us are here today, to commit to right rather than convenient solutions, and the human rights solutions. And now I'll give, please next slide, and I will give floor to the Disability Rights International Executive Director, Eric Rosenthal, to talk about solutions. The next slide, please. And Eric, you have the floor.
Sorry, I was muted. Hello, this is Eric Rosenthal. I'm the founder and director of Disability Rights International. I appreciate this opportunity to speak to you about the children that we've observed in the institutions in Ukraine. We had a team there in April and again in June. I particularly want to thank Helena and the incredible work of the activists in Ukraine, the people with disabilities, the family members who are struggling, who are committed, and who, despite the war, despite the fact that some are speaking to us from bomb shelters, our own staff has been internally displaced, are not able to return to their homes, some of whom are refugees, have continued to fight on. And if there is one message that I've heard from the activists, and I heard that back in 2015 when we published our first report, and I hear it today, is that this system of institutionalization is deeply inhumane. It cannot be fixed, and it must be brought to an end. The demand is coming from Ukrainian activists and family members who are heartbroken to be forced to drop their children off in institutions, who do not want to live in a society in which children are segregated, and who are demanding a Ukraine in which people with disabilities are part of society. This photograph in front of you, I think, captures the inherent dilemma. And you've noticed we have not obscured the face or the eyes of this boy, because we believe that that is dehumanizing and contributes to the essential dehumanization of what is happening. The greatest challenge is these institutions dehumanize the children. It becomes normal. This child is not only tied up in his arms, it's hard to see, but there's a rope around the bottom of the bed. This is a blind boy who is institutionalized because of his disability, and who is now put on a 2-foot tether attached, tied to the back of his bed. He actually knotted himself up and can't really escape the bed itself. It's here because he's left alone in a room, tied up for his own safety. The international law says leaving children tied down is a form of torture. And yet, in this very same institution, your tax dollars and mine are paying for the staff. International funding is coming into this institution by an international organization to pay for staff, to pay for one physical therapist and one massage therapist. Now, there is no doubt that physical therapy and massage therapy are beneficial, but what does it say when we can provide funding to institutions and children are tied down? It is the acceptance of their dehumanization, the normalization of torture on the basis of disability. There was one child in this facility tied to a bench, and actually Helena showed the photograph of a loving mother and father holding that child, because we asked about the child tied to a bench, and it turned out his parents lived 15 minutes away from the facility. We were able to call them in. We were there with a BBC film crew, and next week there's going to be a major story on BBC. These parents would love to keep their child at home, but there's no support for them. If the support were there, they could bring their child home. I interviewed the staff worker of the international organization that's paying for massage therapy and said, why can't you get this child? The parents are 15 minutes away. They want their child. Why can't you do it? And they said, the decisions are not made by me, they're made back home. If the funding were there, we could do this. I said, can you do it in a war? There are no bombs dropping on this town. He said, of course we could do it. We could do it right now if we had the funding and we had the direction. If our funding paid for it, we could get these children back to their families now. We spoke to the local government authorities. We asked them the same question. They would love to work on a program to help get children back into families. if the funding were there, and if the priority were there. I have no doubt that the people in this room, I mean, I am so pleased to get this gathering together today. The skills, the experience, and knowledge to the people in this room have the knowledge as to how to save the life of this child who is losing the opportunity to go to school and play and be loved by his mother and father. Yes, I am confident that the knowledge is in this room right now about how to solve the problem. I am also confident that the money, billions of dollars, are going into Ukraine right now. Billions of dollars. Is the money there? Yes, we need to prioritize it. I believe the greatest challenge in stopping this child from being saved is our own limitations of our own organizations and our own regulations. The end of the fiscal year may be coming. Has the money been spent? Well, unfortunately, the invasion may have not been planned in a way that suits our fiscal year. If our emergency supports are not able to immediately respond to the needs of these child, the problem is our emergency supports. The challenge is our own regulations at our own organizations, and we need to figure out how to fix it. The solutions are there. The loving families are there. There was a UNICEF team in the institution doing an assessment at the time we were there. And I asked, are you assessing the need of these children to get back to their families and what it would take to get them? And the person looked at me like I was a Martian and said, this is Ukraine. This is Ukraine. And the implication is, in Ukraine, children are in institutions, so we are not looking at that question. The truth is, the activists in Ukraine don't want this to be Ukraine. The family members don't want this to be Ukraine. The children know that Ukraine doesn't need to be like this. Ukraine has ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities that provides a right for all children with disabilities to live and grow up with a family. It is a violation of human rights law to place these children in institutions. They have a right to be in a family, not a big institution, not a small institution, not a group home, a family. We need to get them into a family, and international law also says that international funding should not go to institutions except where it is needed for immediate life-saving treatment. And absolutely, immediate life-saving treatment needs to get to them now, and we have to figure out how we can get to them, to the family. The war is not the problem, it's the excuse. The Ukrainians are ready to do it if we set the priority, and let's roll up our sleeves and come up with a solution. I don't want us going to sleep.
Thank you, Eric.
At the end of the fiscal year and have this child still be tied down. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Sorry to interrupt you. We're just managing the time, but thank you so much for such powerful information, insights from Alina, yourself. And precisely, let's roll up our sleeves and talk about very specific aspects of the situation of these children and what is being done and what else should be done about them. So it's my real pleasure to start with our first session and introduce, which was going to be really looking in particular at the situation in terms of what data, what information, what mapping, precisely to Alina's point. How can we plan for services without knowing what the needs are? And to introduce this topic, I'm delighted to say that we have Nara Avetisian, who's the Chief of Child Protection Section at the UNICEF country office in Ukraine. Nara, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Florence. Thank you, colleagues. I'm delighted to be here, and I'm really happy that finally we are talking about children with disabilities in Ukraine, and maybe using this opportunity to raise serious concerns that we all had for years about children with disabilities and the way the state was responding to their needs in Ukraine. But before I start talking about monitoring and the data, etc., what I would like to reiterate is maybe the message that Halina came up with. I think one major challenge that we all face in Ukraine is still prevalence of the medical model and the charity model of disability, and little understanding of the social model. This is despite all the recent developments, including the barrier-free Ukraine initiative by First Lady, etc. There's a long way to go. So it's not just about the willingness, colleagues. It's about the attitude, behavior, and Soviet legacy, because Ukraine, as majority of post-Soviet countries, inherited a very strong system. And to break that system, first of all, we need to change the mindset of people. And to change that mindset, you have to show the best models, the models that are working, community models, preventive models, models that support families instead of supporting institutions. But if you look into these statistics, it will say itself what is happening in Ukraine, because according to official statistics, we have only 159,000 children. This is 2018 statistics, because again, statistics is a serious issue in Ukraine. We have around 159,000 children with disabilities in Ukraine under the age of 18, and this is around 2% of total child population in the country. For those of us who had worked in the area of disability, we know that those figures are definitely very low. This is because those kids are the ones who are receiving disability status. And to get this status, of course, you have to go to different commissions, and then you are measured not only because of, not only looking into your functional areas, but also looking into your medical diagnosis, etc., etc. So starting from assessing the functional areas, we already have the challenge in terms of disability, identification of children with delays and disabilities, and then the way we treat them. And we cannot talk about children with disabilities in Ukraine without talking about children in residential care. Again, I have been working in Ukraine for more than 4 years, and every time I talk to government officials, I get different statistics when it comes to children with disabilities and in general children in residential care. So, I mean, 2 years ago, they were telling we have around 100,000 children. Now we are hearing over 90,000 children. But by the end of the day, this war once again came to show that nobody has a clear picture what is happening. And the reasons are multiple, because there are different institutions under the administration of different ministries. There's no unified database for those institutions. There's no unified database on children, and we don't know what's happening to those institutions that are under the administration of local authorities, etc., etc. What is the major challenge in Ukraine is when it comes to institutionalization, not only for children with disabilities, but also for many other vulnerable families. It's because institutionalization is a kind of state strategy to mitigate family poverty, family migration, address the needs of children with disabilities and other vulnerable categories. And what we also witness in Ukraine, which is a major concern to many international organizations, is that we have very high rate of infants 0 to 3 years old in residential care. And we all know about the impact of institutionalization on child brain development and further impact on the well-being of the child throughout the life. And what we have witnessed in general was that during COVID and due to the ongoing war, not just the recent war, but the war since 2014, we have seen the impact on socioeconomic conditions of the family, and for many families, the only solution to take care of the child or to provide education to the child is to refer the child to boarding school, to different types of institutions. In terms of statistics, you can see that also this infographic shows us the number of children with disabilities in general by their disability status, and the number of families who have a status of families living in difficult circumstances. So it shows at least that in majority of cases, when there is a child with disability in the family, then the overall poverty level, of course, is increasing, and then there's less chance for this family to survive, especially if they are living in Eastern conflict-affected area. The next slide, please. Again, before I talk about, this is one of the latest statistics that we managed to get during the recent monitoring that Eric was referring to, I guess, and this was the first stage of our monitoring because we wanted to see what was the situation in terms of residential care right before the war, and then we were monitoring the situation about those institutions, whether they were staying in the same locations, they were relocated or evacuated. But before I talk about this, I really want to highlight a few things. First of all, I mean, I think Alina mentioned that the way the state is funding the institutions. We know that significant national budget is going for institutional types of alternative care, and almost no efforts made to develop the family type alternative care. And of course, country that is having the third deinstitutionalization reform with failure, with almost no results for children, it's evident that it's a matter of budget, first of all. It's a matter of corruption to me. And I had been raising this issue for a while, because in order to prevent institutionalization, you need to review the entire financial mechanism for those institutions. You need to find a solution to do comprehensive assessment for each institution, but also for each child. Because, I mean, once you refer the child to an institution, it's very difficult to ensure reintegration back to the family. It's much easier to prevent this institutionalization. But for that, you need to have a comprehensive reform agenda in the country. And what we had in Ukraine prior to this war, we had several ongoing reforms: decentralization reform, deinstitutionalization reform, healthcare reform, inclusive education reform, etc. None of them was linked to each other. And they were working on their own, whereas at community level, majority of those reforms were to be implemented. And by the end of the day, instead of using decentralization as a unique opportunity really to promote family reintegration, to come up with strong preventive measures to prevent institutionalization of children, especially those with disabilities, we ended up budget used on something else. We had a project in Eastern Ukraine focusing on integrated social services. And I would never forget my first meetings with local authorities when I was raising my concerns regarding the lack of services or limited access to services for internal displaced population, for children with disabilities and their families, etc. They were telling, no, we need to fix the school, we need to fix the hospital. So the traditional is to spend the budget, local budget, for some visible social services. And of course, nobody was thinking of daycare centers, inclusive education resource centers, etc. It took us 2-3 years really to change the mindset of those authorities, and it happened. This means that the Ukrainian society in general is ready. We just need to invest heavily in the changing of mindset, in providing tools to authorities who are supposed to implement the reforms at local level, to give them the know-how, but also to hold them accountable for things they are doing. The next slide, please. And this is the picture. I just want to make sure, clear that those are not institutions only for children with disabilities, but as we know, majority of children living in residential care are children with disabilities. Some statistics is referring to 40,000 children, the others more. But I mean, what we have seen is that during the recent war, the current war, majority of children who were in residential care institutions were left behind, especially those with complex disabilities, with more severe disabilities, those with intellectual disabilities, etc. And you can see on the left the figures of children that we managed to monitor who were left behind. Then we have institutions who were relocated, and then we have also institutions who were evacuated abroad. And as Halina mentioned, I think the case, definitely we can follow several similar cases when nobody knows where the institution was evacuated, because there were also several private institutions, and because majority of those institutions were under the administration of local authorities, nobody held accountable those local authorities for what they were doing. It looks like none of them really had a system in place to, I'm almost done, system in place to develop an evacuation plan or emergency preparedness plan. And as a result, they ended up in a situation when they had no idea what to do with those kids. And then those that managed to move, they prioritize children without disabilities or children who could be evacuated much easier than the others. And of course, we have issue of cross-border monitoring, etc. And UNICEF is trying to improve this monitoring system, looking into the institutions first. And the second stage is following this picture that we have now, to go to institutions and to do detailed monitoring and best interest assessment for every child. And to finish with my presentation, the next slide, please. What is definitely required in Ukraine, those of you who work in Ukraine know this slide most probably. I've been talking about this. Children with disabilities, as many other children who are having child protection challenges, need a comprehensive continuum of services. And this will provide, first of all, an opportunity for them to have a strong gatekeeping system at community level, services that will provide necessary timely support to families to prevent, to identify early, to do comprehensive assessment, to refer to necessary services, and to make sure that in those cases when child cannot stay with biological family or extended family, there is family-based alternative care solution for these children. Unless we help Ukraine to develop such a comprehensive system of continuum of services at local level, change the mindset of people, we will never manage to have the institutionalization of children with disabilities in Ukraine. I have several other slides, but most probably will be able to cover also during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Naira. This is really, really helpful information. And it's great to actually see some data that shows us the movement of some children, those that are left behind, and to actually see the mappings that are going on. We'd like to open up to some discussion, in particular, looking at the data that you've identified how complex the situation is previous to the war, and therefore how difficult it is to have data in the context of the war. I want to open the discussion around what are the steps, what do we need to do in order to have the full information? Referring back to what Elena said, in relation to not just getting the information around which children are where, but also what is there, what assessments are being done of their situation, what kind of case management is being done, what data is being collected to ensure these children are registered and that their situation is assessed, including the possibility of them being moved to alternative care. So I'd like to open it up for at least a couple of questions, and remind people there's also the Jamboard, which you can see now. So put your comments, your suggestion, your recommendation on the Jamboard as well. But I want to also provide an opportunity for colleagues to ask a couple of questions. And I am seeing Vasilina, please. The floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, very well.
I just wanted to add several more moments, I don't know, characteristic about displacement of institutions, which we should remember about what already was told by colleagues, by Halina and by Naira. So, and especially about baby homes, yes, and because baby homes are children under 3, and for them it's the most dangerous even, yes, I would say, to be still kept in the institution. And what we should have taken into account, because we have been involved with a big team on this monitor and the results which Naira presented, the first, we should remember that some institutions, including baby homes, like baby home from Zaporizhia, have been evacuated in sometimes 3 different institutions, yes. So they were separated from originally, which means the staff who would probably care, for example, when the child wasn't in Zaporizhia, would not be anymore with this child in Lviv. For example, this baby home was evacuated in Lviv, and they are I don't know, placed in 3 different localities. Yes, the same is with, for example, institution for people with disability, with children and young people with disabilities, like Bogodukhivsky institution was evacuated in 3 different places. Yes, and some in 2 different places. And I think it's also very, very negative feature because it also influences already on those established contexts which children have. Yes, and what we mentioned with baby homes, and I would say, frankly speaking, was the most difficult for the monitoring. It was the most closed system. They don't want to anybody to intervene, and they are very glad to receive humanitarian aid from any type of charitable organization. But when you start to ask about exact needs of the child and exact, for example, type of disability, exact rehabilitation the child is need, you will very hardly to get the answer. Yes, and very hardly to get access to the child to get this answer. And also with baby homes, we noticed the very big problem that the quality of care dropped significantly with evacuation. And the most, as Halina mentioned, the left behind were those baby homes which have been called specialized and which have many children with disability, especially those who need palliative care. For example, like we saw the recent case of Odessa. Yes, Odessa baby home has been only evacuated like yesterday or the day before yesterday. Yeah, and they were still under risk. But the main issue and the main problem with evacuation was that they don't have enough people, they don't have enough resources to go with children to support, and children are on palliative care and they don't have resources for transportation and etc. But the same was the problem with other baby homes. When, for example, in the recent before the war research, we have the data that 3 staff members, we have per 1 child in baby home. When we started to move and displace and evacuate children, we have 1 staff member per 10 children. Yes, the vice versa. So the love disappeared, the care disappeared, everything which they promised to children in before wartime have disappeared, and there was nobody to go with children, especially with these young children. And that's why even now they lack a lot of staff, they lack a lot of quality care. The quality of care dropped significantly. And I think it should be also priority that we don't, and also probably request to international community not to fill this institution and baby home with a stock of every possible like food, hygiene, etc. What we need to do, we need to improve the quality of care for these children, and we need to think how better, and this is needed from Ukrainian government, real mechanisms how to make sure that the local authorities where they have now been placed are responsible for these children and have right to place these children in family type care. Yes, because currently this is not very direct possibility and not direct instructions for them to do so. Yes, they still refer that these children belong to some other authorities from where they came from. I think it would be all for the moment. Sorry for taking probably a lot of time.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you, Vasilina. We really appreciate your input into this, and particularly speaking around the situation of the baby's home. We're running out of time a little bit on this discussion, and we need to move to our next question, but this isn't the end of this conversation. So I just want to identify, and looking at the Jamboard, I would encourage you, and it will be open after the meeting, to keep adding your thoughts, your comments, your suggestion and recommendation. But there are some important questions in relation to clearly what the needs are and what kind of assessments are being done and by whom. to understand exactly what services are needed, and in terms of evacuation, where these children are going, and what support is provided or needed for them. There is clearly a recognition that there's both, the context of the war, but that there's also the context of the longer term and the situation and the need to actually support these children with the services that they're not receiving at this stage. Nara, do you have a final quick comment, just because we need to wrap up?
Yes, a quick comment on that, because you just asked a question, what could be done? I mean, in order to have comprehensive assessment, definitely we need a comprehensive case management system in place. And the challenge is Ukraine doesn't have enough social workers. Even prior to the conflict, we had limited number of social workers, and then because of decentralization, the selection process, the training, everything was with local authorities. And it was one of the lowest priorities for local authorities. What we have now is high level of migration among social workers. I mean, it is more than a month we are trying to get the figures from Ministry of Social Policy and State Social Service. And without that, we understand we cannot really count on comprehensive assessment of the needs of the families, referral system, etc., etc. And the same is about institutional care. I mean, what we have is, of course, every child needs to have a comprehensive care plan after getting into the institution, but whether there is the capacity there, definitely no. So again, we can talk about the need to place children in family care, but we do not have enough family care options for majority of children, and we do not have enough social workers who can provide comprehensive case management. And my experience shows that in majority of cases, if we have a strong gatekeeping prevention in place with comprehensive service provision to even the most vulnerable families, you can prevent the child from institutionalization. So I would say the international community should make heavy investment in creating social services and strong gatekeeping in place, and that will help also with the deinstitutionalization, because as Eric was mentioning, if family is ready to take the child, in any case, just why they are referring, not because they don't love and care about their children, because they have no other means at the community level. So we have to create those means, we have to help them. And that would be my proposal to the international community. And thanks to Vasilina, because they were our partners with monitoring. And as we mentioned, this is only the first step of monitoring, because we understand it's quite the cumbersome process, and we need to follow up with every single institution and with every single child. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nara, for this really useful and concrete recommendation. We really appreciate that. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Dragana to facilitate the next session, where we're going to be looking more specifically at the immediate life-saving measures needed to protect children with disabilities in institution. Over to you, Dragana, and to Seth for the presentation.
Thank you very much, Florence, and good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. Before I introduce our next speaker, I would just like to remind people to please leave your comments in the Jamboard. You might be inspired by the presentation you're going to listen to. So please scroll to next sheet on the Jamboard. You will see next frame. Arrow, so please go sheets number 3 and 4 are for our next question. So our topic of this session is the immediate life-saving measures needed to protect children in institutions. And the questions we are asking you is, how can we address the gaps, and what resources are needed, where and by whom? It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Seth Keller. He's a neurologist, a member of American Academy of Development Medicine and Dentistry, also a volunteer expert of DRI, and also a member of Neurology Associates of New Jersey. Seth and Marissa, who kindly prepared this presentation, have both visited institutions in Ukraine in April and June this year. Seth, please, floor is yours.
Yeah, Dragana, thank you very much. I just got back from Ukraine. I just feel literally, I just got off the boat from Ukraine, and I'm kind of still in shock, I guess, about what I saw. Like many on the call and those that have been working with children or caring for children, I've been in the developmental field as a specialist in developmental disabilities, like my colleague Mercer Brown, who's also going to talk in a minute here. But I think I went in there with a certain perspective in what I saw and what I was going to expect, and honored by DRI to be able to go to help assist and view what was going on. And I think the important part in what I'm going to be speaking about with Marissa is the immediate need. Like, what is it we can do now? The big picture, the long-term nature. I mean, we're going to spend time talking about that for decades and years to come, perhaps. But really, what I saw, and if you can go to the next slide, is really basically it's a crisis. Definitely, I'm a huge pro-Ukrainian, and I was shocked, like everyone else around the world, obviously those in Ukraine, about Russian aggression. It was happened, just shocked about what was going on and waving the flag of Ukraine. Definitely, I went in that with my heart, felt exactly what was going on. But also, I definitely have the clear reality of the care for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And I think the one thing that's very important to appreciate, and again, this will come as no shock to people, is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, inherently, many of them have from day one of birth already complex healthcare needs that definitely set them up from birth and through their whole life about the challenge that they're going to face throughout the lifetime. And nothing was more obvious than seeing them in the baby homes as described. But it's really the reality of the inherent nature of swallowing dysfunction or movement disorders like spasticity, or those that also related to spina bifida, very common in autism. And really what's happening is that there's just not being treated. There's not really being treated for their severe scoliosis and their joints and their contractures, leading to really what looks like a terrible, painful situation. And because of these immobilities that a lot of individuals have, that it actually does compare and combine with really significant problems with reduced body weight and malnourishment. And just seeing people living there in the several institutions that we visited and speaking to the medical directors that I had the discussion with, people are dying. I mean, people are literally dying. And those that I even saw in the institutions, I hate to say survival of the fittest. I mean, it's kind of pathetic to even say that. So those naturally who are born with severe developmental disability, who might from birth even have a feeding tube, I didn't see anything like that. And I hate to assume anything about the data and what I saw. I don't know how many people are even surviving to get into the institution that we saw. And those that were in the institution, baby homes and such later, it's just the perpetuation of the horrible nature of which ultimately leads to their demise. There's a high risk of aspiration pneumonia, heart failure. These are things that basically are preventable. This is not an inevitability at all to lead to this demise of this population early and later. And I focus on adults. So we're talking about children, at least in the focus of this conversation. So God bless children, but if you're not providing any early intervention of day one, day two with nourishment and supports, it's tragic. The assessment, I know we're talking about some kind of data collection. There's no doubt about even preventing people getting the institution from day one. We're talking about in the institution, but what about those that are being born now or may need support to kind of keep them at home or in the institution? There's definitely got to be an assessment system, and then the whole broader system of the system network. So that's my talk I wanted to give, and I know we don't have a lot of talk. And Marissa, I'm going to kind of put this back to you. If you can go to the next slide, and I'll let my colleague Mercer Brown take over.
Thank you, Dr. Keller. Based on the observations that both Dr. Keller and I made, we had separate visits in April and June. The immediate attention is securing a team of experts. And this is a very important point, that are not part of the institutional staff. The experts must be independent to be able to provide triage assessments and identify the people who are most vulnerable. There also needs to be a determination of the appropriate levels of nourishment. All the children seem to receive the same diet, whether they appear to be of adequate weight or if they are bone thin. Everyone is eating the same food. And as Dr. Keller mentioned, what are the methods of delivery? We saw children laying in flat beds, children who, because of their skeletal deformities, need to be raised up, perhaps need specialized equipment, need perhaps feeding tubes. None of that is available. And so because of that, all of these health problems become exacerbated. And then in order for anyone to really maximize the use of nutrients that they're taking in, there really has to be appropriate physical and emotional support. These children are living in with absolutely no stimulation. And we know there's plenty of evidence to support that without proper emotional environmental conditions, the nutrients are not maximized. We saw children in pain. You saw pictures of children who were tied down, but there were also children screaming in pain, and there does not seem to be any knowledge of the staff, any ability to assess the cause of that pain. And even children who do demonstrate self-injurious behavior, the first principle of self-injurious behavior is to rule out any physical cause. Are there dental abscesses? Is there pain in the stomach? Is there a positioning problem? To really find the root cause. And then again, there needs to be a team of experts. I would even using those experts that are in the community, in the institutions assessing children, need to then be able to be mobile, to be back and forth in the community to provide training, technical assistance, and resource identification. Next slide, please. So there's also needed, and I was happy to hear from the first session, there is continuity, this independent monitoring of all facilities, no matter what governmental ministry is responsible for the care. There needs to be a high level of monitoring. And those monitoring teams have to include people with a lived experience of disability and family members. I am the proud parent of a son, 40 years old, with autism. Every day he gives me a new perspective on the situation. And so these teams must be integrated. Everyone must have an equal voice. And those teams need to be funded, not voluntary. And the results of the monitoring need to be publicly available. We have to bring in the sunshine, let everybody know what's going on. Not only are institutions often in remote areas, always walls built around them, we have to also break down the walls of lack of information so that people do know what is happening in the institution. And then, as many people have said, establishment of the assessment system to prevent placement in the first place. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Marissa and Seth, for your insights and your recommendation. I will again read the question out loud, seeking for your contribution, and that is, how can we address the gaps and what resources are needed, where and by whom? How can we address the immediate needs of children currently in residential care? I don't have anyone with raised hand for the discussion. We have a very limited time, but would appreciate one intervention if anyone wants to come in. I can also read maybe some comments that we received on the Jamboard, which is, for example, strengthen the capacities of local NGOs and provide funding for needs assessment of children and case management, rapid assessment of nutrition, health, mental health to prioritize service needs, responsive care and mental support for children and families. Start with caregivers that are there now. They are the first resource, giving them information and involving them in deciding what a child needs. Respect and involvement will motivate them. We have Naira, if it's a really short intervention, I just want to say that all the comments that you're leaving will be recognized. We will make a report, so please do continue to come in. My apologies that we are not able to read out loud all suggestions and comments that you're leaving, but we will certainly acknowledge them and include them with the overall report. We have one question, maybe if we can quickly address, and that's what are the types of disabilities of those children institutionalized under 3 years of age?
Yeah, Jagina, can I address that? Yeah, typically what is seen in most institutions or really anywhere around the world is cerebral palsy, autism, and various genetic syndromes. Down syndrome, Dravet syndrome, Lennox-Gastaut, I'm just naming a few. And that's basically typically, and as I kind of stated, I think the severity or the depth of the degree of the severity of the disability will also define on how well or not they basically are able to perform after day one. I mean, unfortunately, there's a high rate of death. I mean, unfortunately, there's a high infant death rate of people with severe developmental disabilities because of their needs right away. People with hydrocephalus. I mean, we saw some people with hydrocephalus. I know that Marissa, on your visit before, untreated hydrocephalus, which is water on the brain. We saw one with hydrocephalus in the facility that I work with, and they got a shunt. It's a procedure to remove fluid, and there wasn't really a great intervention to follow that or track that. But again, there's a whole slew of different types of developmental disabilities that require different levels of support and care. And tragically, I couldn't say that they're getting any kind of early intervention that they need, not only right then and there, but would lead for them as they get older.
If I could add, the toddlers that we saw in the baby home I visited were nonverbal. They looked pretty mobile, but they were left in their cribs all the time with no toys to play with. And so there was not, yes, I'm sure there are some children with more significant disabilities, but there are also children in the baby homes with, perhaps speech and language delay.
Thank you very much, Seth and Marissa, for your response. And thank you, Teresa, for asking this question. Thank you, everyone, for leaving your comments and suggestions on the Jamboard. I would now like to pass on to my colleague, Halina, who will moderate the next session. Thank you very much.
Hello again, and our next session is about the community services and reintegration and support to families and family-based alternatives. We all need to discuss what is required, and we will hear from Mariana Onufric right now, our presenter for the session. She is the head of NGO Family for Children with Disabilities. She is also the deputy head of Ukrainian Children's Rights Network and a longtime advocate and a mother of child with disabilities. Mariana, you have the floor.
Thank you, Halina. Hello to everyone. I will share my presentation. Can you see?
Yes.
As you know, at the beginning of this week, there was Ukrainian Recovery Conference in Lugano. It's in Switzerland. And there was a discussion of the proposals of our government, of Ukrainian government, of some plans how to recover Ukraine after our victory. I would like to stress upon that some representatives of civil society and business association suggest that there are three tasks to recover Ukraine. The first one is reconstruction. In regards of our topic, it is a restoration of destroyed social infrastructure and housing to help a country recover from the war. The second one task is modernization, is a set of changes to move the social and persons with disabilities rights protection spheres to the next level of the development. And the third one is a European integration, the adaptation of the Ukrainian legislation to European one to acquire the status of the member of the EU. Within this presentation, I would like to speak about the reconstruction and modernization, because European integration, it's not has not the main focus on services. So regarding reconstruction, no institutions. Most of you were talking about this during this session, and there are many news in social media and in media that there are some attempts to rebuild, to reconstruct the ruined institutions, unfortunately. So we should advocate not to reconstruct the institution. If we are talking about the recovery of Ukraine and we need to rebuild something, it shouldn't be the institutions. What should we reconstruct? Kindergartens, mainstream schools, healthcare infrastructure, rehabilitation centers, shelters, social service providers, and many others, including the leisure ones, for example, the leisure services for children, for all children. Regarding modernization, it is important to build, because in Ukraine, there are some best practices, some examples on services for children with disabilities, but unfortunately we couldn't say this, it's like a system. It's about early intervention service, it's about inclusive education. Yes, we have a legislation for more than 5 years, but unfortunately it's not like a mainstream policy in Ukraine. Daycare centers for children with disabilities, we should build respite, provide respite care for parents, supported living at the community level, supported employment, and so on and so on. So we should talk not about the reconstruction, but we should speak more about modernization, because there is no we shouldn't have the idea to rebuild the old one system that ruined and is still ruins the life of our children. All rebuilt or built infrastructure should be accessible for persons with disabilities, all of them. Earlier, I talked about kindergartens, mainstream schools, and so on and so on. So there is according to Handicap International Organization, there are 6 criteria that underlie the concept of access. The first one is availability, second one is accessibility, third one acceptability. It's about no humiliation. It's about the respect of the rights of everybody, of in our case a child with disability. It's affordability, it's about the price, accountability, good technical quality, and I would add the 7th one, inclusive. All of this infrastructure should be inclusive, should be for everyone. What is possible to do right now? To dream. And I don't mean only to think and to draw in your mind some beautiful pictures. No, I mean that we should have a vision, a concept of our future system, where children could live with their families and services they could receive at the community levels. Because in Ukraine, there are still a lot of discussions, and we do not have the one vision that all the stakeholders could support. So we should dream, and now we have time, unfortunately, to the victory, to dream a concept, a good vision. We could change legislation now, because yes, we still need to make some changes. We should advocate for the DI. Yes, it's a time, because many people are wondering if it is a time. Yes, it's very good time to advocate the DI. We should provide awareness raising campaign on DI. We should and we can learn and train people, the future specialists who will work at the community levels. We can develop projects, we can fundraise. So we have a lot of to do, and actually everybody hopes that we don't have enough time because victory will be soon, so we should start yesterday. Thank you for your support of all Ukrainians. Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава, Mariana, thank you so much for your presentation. And I'm just gonna remind you about the Jamboard. We are discussing in this session what are immediate and long-term steps needed to the community to support families. And as we see now in the Jamboard, inclusiveness is the main topic. And we have to make everything inclusive. As Mariana mentioned, also the awareness raising is important, and training for the future staff is crucial, so that the mindset allows us to build community supports to all families with children with disabilities. And we have also the comment from Isabel Hodge that education is training is important to address the fears that parents have to, and to counter the influence that directors and staff have over parents. That is a very important comment. I do not see any, if somebody...
hands. There's a couple of hands up, Hanya. I see Anna.
Right? I don't see it.
Yes,
Anna?
we do have two people. We have Anna and Genevieve. So please keep your inputs to 2 minutes.
Oh, okay. I see.
Чутно мене. Доброго дня. Can you hear me? Good afternoon. Good afternoon, dear participants. I will do my best to be succinct, to squeeze my inputs within 2 minutes. I'm the director of the Rehab Center from the city of Dnipro. This is the region that is closest to the front line. We are hosting 250,000 IDPs from Donetsk and Lugansk regions. I would like to say a couple of words about modernization. I really loved Mariana's presentation. Thank you very much indeed. You have raised some really pertinent issues. Apart from modernization, I would like to place emphasis not only on modernization, but also on the renovation of the already existing rehab centers. Why renovation? Because we have quite a slew of competitive institutions in Ukraine that can offer high quality rehab services. And renovation of those centers that proved to be effective and professional and that are capable of providing high quality rehab services is a relevant issue. For example, if you have a center with robust diagnostics of children with disabilities, if there is a center that can offer high quality early intervention services, medical support, there's also preschool inclusive education, and we also intend to set up our in-house school. So my point is that we need to foster the implementation of such models. We need to draft project proposals to this end. We need to raise funds. It's also effective to forge public-private partnership. Unfortunately, we have very few people who have a very good understanding of PPP. What is the thrust of PPP? Because such centers can provide high quality services to all children with disabilities. We have this resolution number 309. When parents go to local social protection services and they ask for rehabilitation for their children in the relevant centers. And based on their request, the government pays the rehab center, so parents do not have to cover rehab-related expenses. So the bottom line is that we need to facilitate the renovation of the already existing high quality and professional rehab centers. This is something that is very opportune. Of course, I can speak for hours and hours, but with due regard for other speakers, I will pause here and I will be more than happy to respond to any other questions that some people might have.
You had your hand up?
Yeah, sorry, I was listening to the interpretation. It was just on slight delay. Thank you very much. I'm hoping that Dr. Ludmila Malkach has been able to rejoin. She was having a bit of internet challenges. I'll cede the floor to her in a second if she is back on with us, but did just want to thank everyone for pulling this really critically important session together, and to say that as far as what is needed to support more inclusive supports, it really has to be the what is the immediate and what is the long-term sustainable approach, how we can leverage the donor funds to demonstrate what is possible to help shift kind of the mindset, but to really strongly trust people with disabilities to be in the lead. True inclusion, and I think there was a comment about this, has to be led by disability first approach. Keystone in Moldova has a long history of this type of work, but also learning from the relationship building and partnership with government to make sure that there is also not just a charitable approach, but a long-term sustainable systems approach. And Ludmila, if you are here, I'll cede my last minute to you. Dr. Malkach.
Thank you very much, Genevieve. Definitely, you know, we need to think, we understand very well that in Ukraine now we have an emergency situation, and that there is not very well strengthened network of social workers across the country, and that there is a very low level of understanding of local public authorities for community living and social inclusion of children with severe disabilities in communities, and there is no services in place. But meantime, we need to use this emergency situation to build this, to change the attitudes, first of all, and that is possible, I think, working with local stakeholders. We need to base all our jobs on strengthening the capacities of local stakeholders. I mean, public authorities, I mean, local NGOs that are still in the country and support persons with disabilities and have some knowledge in how to support persons with disabilities. And I need also, I would like to say that in this, from these perspectives, we need to have the support and allies international NGOs and international organizations that can support jointly emergency response and the sustainable approach for community inclusion of persons with of children with severe disabilities. And we need to take these, let's say, approaches like together, emergency and support for building sustainable services, just for the better future and quality of life of those kids. From my understanding, I do think that there is a lot of expertise in in neighbor countries on how we can support the institutionalization. And if we'll find all the stakeholders that in place can do that, we can just extend or transfer the expertise on the institutionalization and services development from neighbor countries, like, for example, Moldova, because we have this expertise in Moldova, and practically build local capacities in a very, let's say, short time. That is important, because anyway, from abroad, you cannot do anything. You need to have build local capacities and change the attitudes at community level. We need to have a very good network of foster care services in communities. We need to have, first of all, social workers in communities. And we had this in Moldova in 2006 when UNICEF supported salaries for and capacity building for 600 social workers. Practically it was the financial support for 1 year. And after that, the process started, at community level. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ludmila. And I just want to reiterate the point on to make the approach sustainable to the change, we do need to build local capacity, as mentioned by many speakers, and also as mentioned by our Ukrainian counterpart, Anna, is that we do have in place in Ukraine mechanisms that allow local service providers to go and get order from the state so that the state can delegate their ability to provide care to children with disabilities to local service providers that are disability-led. This is very important, and as Anna mentioned, to raise awareness, these mechanisms already exist. However, as also we were speaking, until the mindset changes, these mechanisms seem inaccessible. Well, let's continue this discussion, and I hand over to Severin, and we go to our fourth session.
Many thanks, Alina, and everyone. That was a really important session, and I think the comments from Keystones were really critical to inform this last session, which is really focusing on what are the systems implication that we need to look at, and the systematic reform that need to be integrated in the emergency response. So really looking at that systematic lens. Before I pass on to our presenter, I just wanted to introduce myself, as maybe some of you don't know who I am. I'm Severin Chevral. I am the Senior Technical Advisor for USAID Children at University team advising on care reform and social services workforce. So as for the other sessions, you have the Jamboard where you can provide key suggestion and recommendation, and we will hopefully have a bit of time after this presentation for anyone who wants to speak around this theme. But for now, I will pass it on to Galina Dulat. Hello, Galina, who is with LUMAS and the country director in Ukraine. Over to you. You have 5 minutes maximum, just to make sure we have time for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I know that I have a very short time slot, and I will try to be short. First of all, I would like to say hello, everyone. Thank you, Better Care Network, for this opportunity to share our views on the discussed topic. I did not prepare slides. Hope to be eloquent enough without them. I would start by mentioning that the critical situation of children with disabilities in Ukraine doesn't occur now in wartime. It was historically built in a widespread system of residential institutions inherited from the previous Soviet regime, as was mentioned by speakers earlier. Unfortunately, after independence, not many changes have been made to improve the quality of care and the education of children with disabilities. The same paradigm was followed. A residential institution was and still is considered the only and the best solution to respond to the needs of children with disabilities. From the interventions of the previous speakers, we understood that the current crisis in Ukraine is deepening pre-existing inequalities and exposing the extent of exclusion of children with disabilities. At the same time, the crisis reveals all the weaknesses of residential care. And it is obvious, and also was mentioned by all of speakers, that the residential childcare system has to be reformed based on a holistic approach to child protection, on a socio-ecological model which addresses all main protective elements, including and mainly including family and community. developing community-based support services for children and families, and family type alternatives to replace institution is now crucial. During the emergency response, targeted support programs for children with disabilities and their families have to be implemented to support family reunification and consolidate families' capacity to take care for their own children. It is well known that in the majority of cases, child disability is associated with family poverty. These are the two main drivers of institutionalization. By addressing them through targeted support, the placement of children in residential care might be prevented or at least reduced. Also, the capacities of systems to address the special and complex needs of children with disabilities should be strengthened. There is a pressing need, and it was already mentioned, for developing expertise inside the country, and this expertise should be then further disseminated across communities, because there are no practitioners at the community level, not only social workers, but other types of staff, of professionals who can provide special therapies to children with disabilities and other types of support. In community schools, even there is a very well developed trend on inclusive education. There are no specialized services for children with complex needs, and there is no staff who can provide appropriate support. All these and other related elements have to be considered now in the recovery programs, specifically in the Renewal of Ukraine program as parts of comprehensive child-centered care reforms. As a first step, the Ukrainian government has to revisit its decision from June 2021, when children with disabilities have been excluded from the deinstitutionalization reform. A country plan for the gradual transformation of special residential institutions has to be developed and embedded in articulated national policies. In parallel, the international community has to strengthen and streamline its advocacy work on promoting the rights of children with disabilities to live in their families and learn alongside peers in their communities. The major donors have to put conditionalities on using their funds. Also, internal and external funding must be protected and targeted to investing in developing community care, building protective systems and other resources to ensure the full realization of the rights of children with disabilities. It is time to build really new modern systems, as was mentioned by Mariana, and these new systems should be built on a totally new basis, where there is no place for approaches from the past. These are my initial thoughts, only a few, and I'm happy to hear from others too. Thank you.
Many thanks, Galina. I think those were extremely important recommendations, so many thanks, and I think very complementary to the points that we've mentioned before. So just to repeat the question, basically we're looking at how can systematic reform be integrated into the emergency response in Ukraine. And I am seeing on the Jamboard a lot of really fantastic comments already. Building on what Keystone has said and Galina has said around making sure that the people with disability are leading the process, making sure that the humanitarian response within our disability inclusive with introduction of sustainable and long-term solution. I want to open the floor in case anyone has a key recommendation. Due to time, we can limit it to 2 minutes if possible. Is there any hands up? Not sure I can see. Oh, Rachel, I think your hand was up, and then Lauren, I'll go to you. Rachel?
Sorry, was that me, Rachel? Which Rachel are you referring to?
Rachel Keane.
Yes, hello. Hi, thank you so much. I am from the FCDO, which is the UK government, and I am our Gender, Disability and Inclusion Advisor for Ukraine and the region. For the past 6 years, I've been our disability rights technical lead. And so, yeah, this is an incredibly important session. And as somebody who's both a disability specialist and a disabled woman herself, I think it is quite sombering for all of us and does show how critical and urgent some of the needs are. I think rather than giving a lovely donor type spiel, because I'm terrible at being a good donor and sticking to what you're meant to say and how wonderful we are, I'd be keen to flag what some of the real challenges have been, and perhaps some of the, very quickly, the key ways I think of accessing donors and where to really be encouraging where the entry points are right now. And I know my colleagues from the US who are also very committed to this are online. I would say, you know, working on the humanitarian response from someone who's got a long development background has been quite eye-opening. And certainly when we're looking at the immediate needs, the humanitarian needs, it's a real challenge when we're talking about speaking the language of humanitarians. And sometimes it can even be off-putting when they think what we're talking about when it comes to deinstitutionalization is, you know, reconstruction or development work. And I think it's really critical for all of us to be very clear in how important that nexus is between that humanitarian and development when it comes to this. And actually that life-saving assistance is absolutely critical as we move into looking at modernisation and reform. And I know particularly there are partners here who've had real struggles, for example, working with Moldova, where they've had great relationships with foster families and so forth, but government of Ukraine very much wanting to keep children in institutions together. So there is a real challenge there. But I would say when looking at access and entry points to humanitarian funding, humanitarian support, you know, really being able to have that framing of that critical life-saving assistance for the most vulnerable. And if we are looking at needs assessment about who is most in need, most at risk, most marginalised and excluded, there is no denying that children with disabilities, children and adults in institutional settings are amongst the most there, and that all of us have made wonderful statements and rhetorics and obligations, both governments, the international system, that need to be, you know, hold us to account on, is one of the big things I would flag there, is that there is a very strong framework, including Ukraine itself. I think lack of technical expertise has been a challenge, and we do need to recognise there's a huge amount within Ukraine itself that we should be relying on, rather than just relying on internally and partners who we may be used to working with but are not specialists when it comes to disability inclusion and deinstitutionalization. And I would also say, you know, there's real opportunities when looking at, as we go into reconstruction, dialogues about corruption as well, where lots of you know, donors and actors are interested and involved, and this all really cuts across when we're looking at a modernisation agenda and a social inclusion agenda, and particularly pushing that participatory approach. Do approach donors with your needs assessments, send them. Don't assume that they are getting them, and as well, you know, do push what your asks are to government of Ukraine. What are your asks to partners and what are your asks to us? Because I think that's also something donors are looking at. So I'm going to take a deep breath and finish there. But yeah, I'll put my email in the chat, and I am, you know, as Eric and others know on this chat, I am always very keen to talk. I'm very keen to ensure that we are supporting you wherever we can.
Many thanks, Rachel, and hope the background noise is nothing too serious. Lauren, I saw that you had your hand up at one point. I'm not sure if it's still up. Let me know if you want to provide any recommendation.
Hi, Seb. Yeah,
Hi,
thanks so much. I think I basically just everything I wanted to say, I think is what Rachel said. I think that there's something about making sure that we're integrating into the humanitarian architecture, making sure that systematic reforms are part of the humanitarian response plans, and linking up with the various humanitarian coordination mechanisms in each country. And the reason I kind of say that and push for that, I think partially because it helps to allocate funding, and it's how a lot of organizations will structure their responses. But I think there's also something around utilizing that to work with other sectors. And it's been such an incredible time together to look at how much we rely on the other sectors and the other thematic areas to be able to do this work meaningfully. So being able to bring a really concrete action plan to humanitarian and development actors to figure out who's best placed to do what, who's got access to the funding, and then who can influence the other thematic areas or sectors. So I think I put on every page, so sorry for whoever's compiling, something around having cash top-ups, protection-specific cash top-ups to families who need it. Because we know cash assistance is already happening. So making sure there's linkages there and linkages with the education sector and the health sector, et cetera. And I think if we have a really clear strategy, but more than that, an action plan, I think that we're able to then influence the other sectors and help them to understand what's their role. Because oftentimes I think we've got the response is quite a significant amount of funding, but I think the big question mark is often where do we start? And the expertise is here, so let's put pen to paper to make it something really concrete, and people can say, oh, that's something I can contribute to. That's it from my side. Thanks, Seb.
Thanks so much, Lauren. And I think it also links to Alison responded to Eric's question, to really link up with the UN and the coordination mechanism, who are, many of them are receiving the funds, and making sure that we are working with them and to develop those action plans that you mentioned, Lauren. And that is cross maybe clusters and groups to make sure it is at the highest priority. Alison, sorry, I was reading and adding and commenting on your anything else you want to add, and then we'll try to very quickly do 1 minute for Ludmila and 1 minute for Neira. Go ahead, Alison.
Thanks. Hi, I'm calling in from the State Department, and I oversee some small amounts of funding on disability rights inside Ukraine, and it's all targeted at advocacy, not necessarily providing the funding to, structures that the Ukrainian government ought to be funding into, or UN level organizations like UNICEF that was invoked by Eric. So I just wanted to share that my email address is also sprinkled throughout the chat and inside of the Jamboard, and I'd welcome any specific asks that people on this call have that we might be able as the US government to pass over to UN bodies. If you give me if you have people that you specifically would like to hear the message from the USG side of things, I'm happy to pass that along with evidence and data and requests. I don't have those networks and contacts, but if it's possible that my state.gov email address might be assisting you in some of your advocacy efforts towards those UN bodies, then I'm happy to play that role.
Thanks, Alison. And I know a report will come out of these sessions, and so hopefully that will also provide some key messaging that we can then pass on. Ludmila?
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to say that definitely I am supporting Lauren based on our expertise of working with children with disabilities, refugees from Ukraine and Moldova. I do think that it is very important to work closely with UNHCR. It is very important to support and to establish a task force on protection of children with disabilities in Ukraine. and also to integrate all these activities in emergency action plans of UNHCR in order to support children with disabilities and families. In this regard, I do think that there are types of services that we developed during the sustainable time in Moldova, but we use them now for children with disabilities refugees and can be sustainable developed after. And I'm talking about mobile team services. You know, that means these mobile team services that consist now, for example, in case of Moldova, we are supporting refugees from a social workers for case management and medical doctor and psychologist. They can assist children in emergency situation in families. I mean, children with disabilities. After that, this mobile team can work in a sustainable way, you know, after the war, because they will also be like housing services assisting children with disabilities. We need to think on very comprehensive and value integration between these emergency services and sustainable services for the future based on expertise of other countries, neighbor countries. Thank you.
Many, many thanks, Ludmila. And I believe there is a regional working group that UNHCR and UNICEF are facilitating that looks at those issues around cross-border and hopefully you can participate and influence in those discussions.
Yes,
really
and there
important.
is a very good data on children, and I think that they also have very good data on evacuated children in Ukraine, because we have those data from the data group under the UNHCR in Moldova.
Wonderful. All right, I think we are running out of time. Nara, maybe 30 seconds. And Ina, I'm not sure we'll have time, so I apologize in advance.
Just a quick comment on what Alison and others mentioned about UN agencies. Just because I'm also UN disability focal point, UNICEF was asked to do that. I mean, actually, UN agencies have a disability inclusive program. And one of the priorities is disability inclusive humanitarian response. I mean, just today in the morning, we had this meeting with UN agencies discussing the opportunities, and we are using every single chance through cluster system, which is the emergency humanitarian response system, be that protection cluster, gender-based or child protection subcluster, to raise our concerns. Because one of the recommendations would be that we reiterate UN's commitment to disability inclusive humanitarian response, and we consider the humanitarian response with long-term recovery and development programs to make sure that we develop sustainable solutions for families with children with disabilities and people with disabilities in general. This would be my message. And I think for donors, it's really critical that every time you provide funding, not only to UN agencies, but also to civil society organizations and to the government of Ukraine, you reiterate this message that whatever is done in terms of humanitarian response and programming, it should be disability inclusive. It should have disability inclusive data disaggregation, because we are still missing, even if colleagues in Moldova consider it is there, it is not. Sorry, I mean, I was asking government to share statistics, and you have seen a majority of statistics we received. Those are government sources. They are not disability disaggregated, age and disability disaggregated. Definitely, we need to improve the data collection analysis.
Yeah, and I thank you very much, Naira. And I would add as well that any programming and support is also looking at family support type of approaches. So obviously gathering the data, but also starting to look, to really promote that family support approach. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So apology, Ina, if you can, you and others can add additional recommendation to the Jamboard, and I will pass it on to Dragana to close. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Severin, and thank you everyone again for your participation, active participation and contribution to this important discussion. What I was hearing is that expertise is here. We had amazing comments, people offering solutions, so thank you very much for all your inputs. If we were not able to address them out loud, be assured that we will definitely include that in our report. And I think that what Lauren said is very important, and that we, after identifying very specific steps that need to be done, we need to get into this the discussion who, where, and when can do that. And hopefully this meeting is the first step, and we will be able to reconvene with this amazing group of people and, you know, take the step forward and identify who is able to do what of these steps that we have identified today. So thank you very much. What my takeaway from here is that we have the expertise. What we need is first commitment by the Ukrainian government. And I believe that our unified voice of organizations, agencies, donors is really needed to push and to motivate Ukrainian government to commit to change the system of care for children and support for persons with disabilities. Second, I think the message is clear that there is no space for waiting. We have to get engaged in these reforms now, using both emergency and development funds, making sure to address the issue of segregation and institutionalization across different sectors, across different funds, so we don't end up segregating this support ourselves, but rather make sure that all these efforts are coordinated. So change is needed right now. The approach that we are taking, I believe it's clear, and we definitely need to hear voices of people from Ukraine that I've been hearing over and over again, and that is that they want new Ukraine without institutions. So I have hope that we can all work together to ensure that. So thank you very much again for contributing. We will make sure to get back to you and re-engage in the discussion after we share this report, so we can actually do action planning and next steps, how we can all work together to achieve and contribute to the reform that will ensure new Ukraine with no institutions for children with disabilities. Thank you.